Welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining. We're going to give it another couple minutes before we kick it off here. Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining. We're going to give it about 2 more minutes and then go ahead and kick it off.
Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. Thanks again for joining us today. Really excited to have all of you here. Looks like we have a nice sized group. I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to join me for part 3 of my Cloud Volumes on Tap for Disaster Recovery webinar. Today's subject is going to be SVM DR, which I think is a really interesting topic and quite frankly, one that we don't talk about quite enough. Anyway, my name is John DeMasi. I'm a Technical Customer Success Program Manager here at NetApp. I'm located in RTP, North Carolina, where the sun is shining for the first time in a week, so I'm pretty excited about that. And by the way, my technical focus area is Cloud Volumes on Tap, so it's been my pleasure to deliver this webinar series, and hopefully I've worked with a fair number of you already just as part of the Customer Success Program. Anyway, without further introduction, here's the agenda for today's session. And just so you know, my goal is to finish this webinar in about 30 minutes. We're not going to go super deep into the subject of SVM DR. I'm going to give a what I think is a pretty good high-level overview that will help you understand why you might be interested in using this feature of SnapMirror and whether it makes sense for your environment. I am positive there will be questions that I don't get to today, so please don't hesitate to reach out to me directly. I showed my email address before, I believe, and I'll show it again at the end. And of course, we'll be sending these slides out to you after the presentation is over, so you'll be able to refer to all the materials that I share and get my contact info. In case you want to reach out, we're happy to work with you individually on your particular situation. Anyway, so here's the agenda for today. We're going to just, at a high level, describe what SVM DR is, talk about how to configure it. We'll discuss the failover and failback process. I'll go over some specifics that you'll need to know using SVM DR with Cloud Volumes ONTAP, and then I'll do a brief demonstration. The intended audience of this webinar is for ONTAP customers who are interested in learning how storage virtual machine disaster recovery can improve their disaster recovery strategy, specifically with regards to Cloud Volumes ONTAP. All right, awesome. Let's get into it. So at a high level, storage virtual machine disaster recovery, or SVMDR, for those of us who like to spare the syllables when we can, is a SnapMirror feature that allows customers to replicate storage virtual machines with their associated volumes and configuration. And that is really useful because SnapMirror is typically done at the volume level as opposed to the SVM level. Quick level set for anyone who's maybe more familiar with Cloud Volumes ONTAP than the nuts and bolts of ONTAP itself. The storage virtual machine, or an SVM, is a virtual machine that serves data to clients as part of your ONTAP cluster. It contains data volumes, and it has one or more logical interfaces. And then SnapMirror is NetApp's ONTAP native replication technology for replicating data from ONTAP systems to other ONTAP systems. Okay, cool. So I kind of hinted at this already, but the reason why SVMDR is really useful is that SnapMirror relationships are typically set at the volume level. SVMDR replicates volumes hosted by an SVM in addition to the SVM's configuration data. So, why is that useful? Basically, if you have a SnapMirror source and a SnapMirror target, any changes that you make on the SnapMirror source side in terms of the number of volumes that you have or the configuration of the SVM on that source side, if you add a volume and you're not using SVMDR, you're going to have to create another volume level SnapMirror relationship in order to protect that volume. And then, of course, if you're not using SVMDR and you make a configuration change on the source VM that you want to carry over to the destination side, you're actually going to have to go and make that change manually because volume level SnapMirror replication isn't going to cover that for you. So in a nutshell, SVMDR just makes managing your SnapMirror disaster recovery process a little bit simpler. You can focus on SVMs without having to make additional relationships for any new volumes that get added. And, change management is just a little simpler because you don't really have to do it. It's automatic. So that's sort of the reason why, you might consider using this feature. Now I've got a quick little animation showing the way that SVMDR works. It's fairly straightforward, but I think it's instructive. I like pictures. So say that you have a client accessing data, and we're just going to use NetApp hardware as the example here. Cloud Volumes ONTAP would be the same story, just a different logo. Anyway, so you have a client accessing data through an ONTAP cluster. In this case, it's an HA pair. Doesn't really matter. There's two SVMs here. And we're saying that there's a second ONTAP cluster that is paired with the first ONTAP cluster. They're using SVMDR to replicate that finance SVM to the destination cluster over here. Now let's say something happens to the source cluster, an asteroid, meteor, I don't know, any kind of terrible thing. We then activate the destination cluster, which, keep in mind, already has our SVM and all of its constituent volumes. And then we just switch our data access to go through the destination cluster. Very similar to the standard concept of how SnapMirror works, except a little bit simpler because we're focusing on SVMs. Then let's say that the disaster has passed. We've been working off the secondary cluster. And we're ready to sync back to the source or the original source. I know the nomenclature can get kind of confusing when you're syncing and resyncing. But now keep in mind, we've been accessing our data through this new cluster now, as opposed to the original. Any changes that we've made to the configuration of SVM Finance DP, any volumes that we've added, all that's going to be resynced back to the original source when we resync. So that failover and failback is very simple. And we're back to data access as usual. Cool. So that at a high level is what SVMDR is and how it works. So next we're going to talk about how you set it up. How do you configure it? And specifically, how do we move that configuration data for your SVMs? So I've already alluded to this as well, but SVM DR configuration and processes are extremely similar to what you're already used to with standard volume level SnapMirror replication. A lot of it's going to seem very familiar, and that's because it is. The main difference that you're really going to have to deal with is what you want to do with your SVM configuration data. And we'll talk about that in a second. Something else to know is that right now, you're probably going to have to configure SVMDR using the ONTAP CLI or command line interface. Unless you're running ONTAP 9.5 on your source and your destination, in which case you'll also have on-command System Manager 9.5. You'll have to use the CLI. If you have ONTAP 9.5 in your source and your destination, you can actually use the System Manager graphical user interface instead of the CLI if you prefer. For today's demo, I'm going to stick with the CLI just because ONTAP 9.5 is real recent, and I'm assuming that a lot of you haven't made that upgrade yet. So we'll keep it simple, but I will give you resources to understand how the System Manager version works as well. Anyway, so the most important thing to know about configuring SVMDR is that you're going to have to deal with that SVM configuration data. You can replicate it from the source to the destination, or you could replicate only some of it. So the key option to know here is the identity preserve option. Ooh, I said that weird. Identity preserve option. That's very important. You'll use that option when you're creating your SnapMirror relationship, and that will determine which configurations are replicated to the destination. So if you set identity preserve to true, that'll replicate pretty much the entire SVM configuration except for SAN protocols, which just aren't supported by SVMDR at this time. Then it's also good to know, and by the way, the next two slides will be pictures of these options so you could get a better picture of what's going on, no pun intended. But you also have the option, if you use identity preserve true, when you create your SnapMirror policy, you can use the discard configs network option. If you want everything else to go over except for the network configuration. And of course, if your destination SVM's in a different subnet, there's a really good reason you wouldn't want to transfer that network configuration data. Then of course, identity preserve can also be set to false, in which case you'll only be replicating the constituent volumes of your SVM and then the authentication and authorization configurations of that SVM. So these are the configurations that can be replicated. I believe this is a slightly condensed list. I will give you a link to the full list of everything. But you can get an idea of the sort of stuff that we can replicate using identity preserve true, CIFS policies, name services, CIFS server, and of course all the volume information, and that'll go either way. If you are in a situation where you want to replicate all of this data except for the network policies, keep in mind you can use network configs discard, or sorry, discard configs network on your SnapMirror policy. Cool. And then if you do set identity preserve to false because you don't want all that configuration information being replicated to the destination for whatever reason, this is what will be replicated with identity preserve false in the green over here. Basically just the information you need to access the data. Then all this other stuff on the right that's in red will not be replicated if identity preserve is set to false. So clearly this is pretty detail oriented. Before implementing this solution, you'll definitely want to take a detailed look at the full configurations that are replicated. I'm giving you those links here. The top link is to the ONTAP documentation that shows you every single configuration that is replicated or not replicated with the different combinations of identity preserve and nowhere configs discard. And then the second link is the SVM DR preparation express guide. Gives you a lot more information on the sort of nuts and bolts of actually getting this configured, and instructions for the CLI. And just a minute here. All right, cool. So we'll talk briefly about the SVM DR failover and failback processes. Again, this is pretty similar to what you're used to already with standard volume level snap mirror. So to fail over, you'll quiesce snap mirror transfers from the destination, abort any ongoing transfers, break that SVM DR relationship so that the destination becomes read-write. If identity preserve is true, stop that source SVM, and then you can start the destination SVM. Then, of course, the failback workflow, also very similar to volume level snap mirror. You're going to resynchronize your source from your destination, stop your destination, update the snap mirror relationship, start the source, and then resync the destination from the source. Just seem very familiar. No real surprises there, hopefully. And then, of course, I do have additional information on sort of the details of the failover and failback workflow. No big gotchas, but this is some really good documentation that takes you through the different permutations of what this will look like depending on your configuration. Really great resource. Highly recommend checking it out. Cool. So now for sort of the meatiest part of the session, let's talk about Cloud Volumes ONTAP and SVMDR in particular. Some things that you'll want to know if you're considering using SVMDR with Cloud Volumes ONTAP. So the most important thing to know is that Cloud Volumes ONTAP only supports one data serving SVM per working environment. Now you can create multiple SVMs for disaster recovery relationships, but the supported configuration for Cloud Volumes ONTAP is only one data serving SVM. So if you're in a situation where you have a working environment that you're using for some kind of ongoing workload, like maybe it's a file share, then you have a second SVM that is serving as a data protection destination. Just know that if you find yourself in a situation where that second data protection SVM needs to become read-write and start serving data, you're probably not going to have the same quality of experience that you're used to with Cloud Volumes ONTAP and only one data serving SVM. So that situation should be avoided or minimized if possible. And the reason for that is pretty simple. The amount of performance that we're able to get out of Cloud Volumes ONTAP is limited by the size of the virtual machines that we're able to get from Azure and AWS. Just in our experience, in our own testing thus far, we haven't really seen that even the biggest virtual machines those hyperscalers can provide to us just deliver enough juice to have more than one SVM serving data at sort of an enterprise state. If you are going to try to do this, where you're doing more than one data serving SVM and you're in a failover situation, just know performance will probably be impacted, and it'll work best with workloads that are on the smaller side. If you are doing disaster recovery for a really performance-intensive workload where performance is really important, make sure that's the only SVM in the working environment. That's the best guidance right now, and we'll be sure to update that as things change and we're able to hopefully lift this limitation. All right, cool. So that's the most important thing to know. Besides that, it's good to know that Cloud Volumes ONTAP is already fully licensed for SVMDR. You do need a snap mirror license at your source and your destination. So if Cloud Volumes ONTAP is your destination, which it probably will be for a lot of you, just make sure you have a snap mirror license at your source as well. Then one last thing to know about Cloud Volumes ONTAP and SVMDR is that On-Command Cloud Manager, which is that user interface that you use to deploy and manage Cloud Volumes ONTAP, it does not support SVMDR just yet. So in order to configure SVMDR, you're going to have to use either the ONTAP CLI, or if you're on ONTAP 9.5, you can use On-Command System Manager and do it using the graphical interface. All right, cool. So that is basically all the content I wanted to get through today. I'm about to jump over to the demonstration. Before I do that, does anybody have any questions? I believe the lines are muted, so please feel free to just pop your questions into the question and answer. I can't promise that I'll get to all of them today. We may have to follow up separately after the call. But yeah, if you happen to have any, go ahead and pop them in. If I don't see any within the next minute or so, I'll jump over to the demonstration. And that's perfectly fine with me.
We do have one question in the chat window.
I wasn't looking at the chat. Thanks, Jill. Okay, cool. So what would be the reasons for not using Identity Preserve? That's a great question. So, you know, it's really about how similar the environment that your source and your destination are at, right? So if it makes sense for your source and your destination to access, for example, the same CIFS server, you know, that's a situation where Identity Preserve would be helpful. But if, for example, say we're protecting an on-premises data center and your ONTAP and your CIFS server on the same rack on top of each other, you know, maybe that's a situation where you don't want to preserve that identity because those will both go down at the same time, and you'd want to use a different CIFS server in your data protection destination. So that sort of consideration is, you know, while you might want to use or not use Identity Preserve. And, you know, by the way, feel free to reach out to your customer success manager. We can certainly help you make that determination. Cool. Well, I haven't seen any other questions roll in as of yet, so I'll jump over to the demo, which is the fun part of the presentation. Cool. So for our demo today, I have a small lab environment set up. I'm going to be showing how an SVM DR relationship works between two clusters. So on the left side of my screen, we have cluster 3. On the right side of my screen, we have cluster 4. Cluster 3 is going to be our source, and cluster 4 is going to be our destination. I've actually already prepared the environment and configured the SVMDR relationship, and I'll give you a quick walkthrough what I did. So cluster 3, our source SVM is called SVM3. And then on cluster 4, I've created a DP destination SVM. It's called SVM3 DR. That's going to be our destination SVM in our SVM DR relationship. Cool. So start off, I'm going to show you that these two SVMs are configured the same way and have the same volumes. So let's take a quick look. SVM3, NFS CIFS, fiber channelized SCSI, SVM3DR, and NFS CIFS, all the protocols. All right, cool. So to show you how a configuration change will be replicated from source to destination, I'm just going to jump into SVM3 and disable the CIFS protocol for no apparent reason, just because. There we go. So SVM3, our source, no longer allows the CIFS protocol. Now let's take a quick look at our volumes. So right now, let me restrict this to SVM3. You can see that SVM3 and SVM3DR have the same volumes. So to show you that a volume change will also be replicated, we're going to add a new volume. We're going to call it SVM DR works because that's the whole point. All right, cool. So you can see now we have an additional volume on our source that hasn't been replicated to the destination yet because I just haven't updated the snap mirror relationship. So that's what I'm going to do next, and we'll look to see that this configuration change, disabling CIFS, is replicated, and then that additional volume is also replicated. And as promised, I'm going to use the CLI for this exercise. That's probably the experience that you're going to have, at least for now. So the CLI window on the right side of the screen, that's also cluster 4. I'm just using the command line interface instead of the graphical interface. So let's just verify what we saw before. SVM3 DR, that vServer exists. It's a subtype DP destination. Okay, very cool. I'll show you that I do have a cluster peering relationship between cluster 4 and cluster 3. Also good to see I've configured a SVM peering relationship between SVM3 and SVM3DR. And you can see the peering application there is SnapMirror because that's what we're going to be using. And then one last thing I'll show you is just that I have already created this SnapMirror relationship, the SVMDR relationship between SVM3 and SVM3DR. Take note here, our source path and our destination path, they're not volumes, they're actually SVMs. And that's actually the main difference in the commands too. You just stop at the SVM, don't put the volume in. Anyway, cool. So we made those configuration changes. We changed the volumes on the source. Let's go ahead and update our SnapMirror. So SnapMirror update, destination path is an SVM. Now I'm going to show our SnapMirror relationship. This time I'll expand the view so we can see all the constituent volumes are also updating. And we can see that our new volume is being transferred. So give it a second. This should be a pretty fast update. Let's just make sure everything goes idle before we go to see that it worked. Huh. Oh, duh. I used the wrong command there. SnapMirror show, not SnapMirror update. We already did that. All right, cool. So we can see that our SnapMirror relationship is idle. The mirror state is SnapMirror. It's healthy. The update worked. So let's see our results. So I'm going to refresh the view here for SVM3DR. We're looking to see that CIFS protocol disappear. And there it goes. So that configuration change was replicated from the source to the destination. Very cool. Let's take a look at our volume view. We want to make sure that that new volume SVMDR works was created. And there it is. I was not lying. It does work, and that's how it works. Very cool. So we are actually, looks like we're running right on time to finish this webinar within 30 minutes, which I'm excited about. I love it when the trains run on time. Before we conclude, are there any lingering questions? Go ahead and pop them into the Q&A or the chat. All right, cool. I'll take that as no questions at this time. Anyway, to wrap up the presentation, I put all the resources that I mentioned during this, this chat in one page at the end of the presentation. We will be sending this to you afterwards. Everything I referenced is right here in one place. I've also included some information on using On-Command System Manager to configure SVMDR. It's pretty straightforward, but there you go. You got a demo and a blog post on the subject, so I wanted to make sure you're covered. We already checked. Oh. We do have a question from VJ. Thank you. Yes. So does the replication happen based on the policy? I assume you mean the replication schedule. Is it based on the SnapMirror policy that is set? Yes. And policies, all that good stuff that you're used to with volume level SnapMirror, that all carries over to SVMDR. Cool. Well, I am out of time. I want to thank you all again for joining today. Appreciate you taking some time out of your day to join me for this conversation. Here's some additional resources just for customer success and cloud data services in general. I would also say, hey, we've probably been on a few webinars together by now. Please feel free to reach out to me on social media. I am on LinkedIn. My name again is John DeMasi. Here's my email address, jdemasi@netapp.com. Please feel free to reach out to me with any questions. Happy to help. And just a couple of closing thoughts. Hey, if you haven't been to cloud.netapp in a little while, check it out. This is a site that NetApp updates quite frequently with the latest and greatest, what's going on with our cloud data services offerings. I think if you check every week, every other time you log in, you'll find something new, which is really cool. And then, hey, if you haven't talked to your customer success manager recently, I'm sure we'll be reaching out to you, but feel free to reach out to us. We love to hear from you. And we look forward to seeing you on the next webinar. So thanks again for your time. Have a great day.